Hi, everyone. This is going to be our fourth interview in this series to tackle Web3 accessibility. In this interview, we are going to be discussing a research paper titled Exploring the Accessibility of Crypto Technologies, and it's a study analyzing the accessibility of centralized exchanges and cryptocurrency. So we're privileged to have with us today Benjamin Gorman of Bournemouth University and Garreth Tigwell of Rochester Institute of Tech. Thank you both for being here.
Cool, thank you.
Nice to be here, yeah.
Can we start with some intro into your respective backgrounds?
I'm going to let Ben go because you're in the middle. We go in order.
Yes, my name is Benjamin Gorman. So I'm a lecturer at Bournemouth University, which is on the south coast of England. I've been at Bournemouth for, I think it's about 4 years now. Before that, I did my PhD at the University of Dundee, where I kind of broadly looked at technologies to help people with hearing loss, particularly helping them to learn how to lip read. At Bournemouth, I do kind of a wide range of kind of accessibility research and accessibility teaching as well. More lately, we've been doing, myself and Gareth have been doing work on helping people with visual impairments, looking at things that are inaccessible. With regards to this paper was on crypto technologies, but we've done other work broadly looking at how emoji are inaccessible as well. So it's kind of where my background and expertise is.
Cool. So yeah, I'm Garreth Tigwell. I'm an assistant professor within the School of Information at RIT. I joined in coming up 4 years ago now, and I teach and do research in topics related to accessibility and human-computer interaction. My research is primarily kind of covers the areas of design and accessibility in HCI. And I've been particularly looking at kind of improving the design of digital systems in such a way that improves user experience and makes technology more accessible for people. And one way that I've been focusing on kind of achieving this is understanding how digital creators work. So the tools that they use, where in the design process there are challenges that are affecting their ability to create accessible and usable content. And I also got my PhD at Dundee as well. So Ben and I have known each other for quite a while now.
Well, to start, let's briefly cover the importance of this work. So what are some existing barriers to crypto adoption or challenges with this type of research?
Talking like the challenges of doing this sort of research, I think the first challenge that we had is actually getting people to realize that you're not like trying to scam them, right? Because it's about financial issues, or you're asking people what their financial background, especially with something like crypto technologies, where people are aware that there is no financial institution behind them in most cases. So if they are scammed out of their money or they're misled somehow, then people tend to be a bit more concerned about that. So I think one of the first challenges is coming across as authentic in doing research, right? We had multiple instances of when we tried to gain access to participants through subreddits and places like that, where people were saying, well, you're not allowed to post surveys or that kind of thing, because again, in the past, they have had instances of people trying to mislead and steal information. So I think that's maybe one of the first concerns people have maybe working on this area. And I vaguely remember even our ethics departments, and I think we went through RIT's ethics department, had concerns over the level of information we were asking about people's financial backgrounds, even though it wasn't really that detailed, right? But we had to make it very clear that people didn't need to divulge how much of an asset they had or whatever, due to that kind of, again, fear around financial losses and that sort of a thing. So I guess that would be one of the first things I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think another thing that came up as well was, well, kind of to the other part of the question about kind of barriers to crypto adoption. I mean, I think that there's going to be many barriers that even go beyond the work that we've been doing. And I think that, reflecting on kind of emerging technologies, it's a common trend where we see new technology comes out and there's not been like full consideration of accessibility. And then maybe we as researchers and people that use assistive technology, it's kind of playing catch up in trying to like improve the situation. So what we'll probably talk about today is things related to screen reader accessibility and some of the findings of our paper. But going beyond that, there's many barriers that we've probably not even touched upon in our paper that exist. And I think part of the other thing was that if the barrier to entry is difficult and we're looking for participants for this type of research that we were interested in doing, there's not as many people to kind of approach and speak to. And speaking to people and getting insights from them is going to be the most useful thing. But there's just not as many people out there. I mean, crypto itself as an area where just the general public are interested in, it's not really mainstream to the extent of like other kind of things, like social media usage as a comparison. Social media accessibility has been a big interest in research for a while, and lots of research continues to go in that domain. But you've now got the numbers there in terms of like reaching out to people. And so one of the challenges that we had was just trying to get enough people that maybe use assistive technology or have an accessibility access needs, and so on, to kind of find out like what challenges they might encounter in this. So I think that we definitely got some participants and we had some interesting findings. We probably don't have the full story yet, but I think we can also and what we kind of did with our work was I guess sort of draw on our expertise around kind of how we've seen these things go in the past. So like I mentioned, when new technology comes out and there's often issues. So and that's kind of why we, where this initial kind of interest in doing the project was, because we kind of had a good idea that it's probably not very accessible for people.
Yeah, that's totally fair, especially like you said, for emerging technologies. When you have new tech, it's like the gap is so wide and it's like hard to narrow it. And it's hard to completely address it, but as long as you can keep it narrow, that's what matters.
And I think that's where like approaches such as inclusive design should be followed by these corporations, right? Like companies like Binance and Coinbase, they have maybe big developer teams, but there's really no necessarily evidence of them doing inclusive design, right? I mean, they might be doing that, right, behind closed doors, but to what we found in our work, they've not necessarily designed their systems in an inclusive way. So it's unlikely they've done that with inclusive design behind it, right? So they probably don't have people of diverse abilities on their teams working on these issues, around the design of their systems, right? So if they followed that from the start, then we wouldn't be in the situation where they have issues that need to be rectified. So, and especially with emerging technology, that's why that approach is so important, right? So we don't need to kind of retrofit and kind of try and fix things after the fact. They're designed to be inclusive in mind, right? So
yeah, for sure. And that's why this work is very significant, just to start that conversation. I mean, we were ecstatic to see this paper out there. Centralized exchanges are essentially the entry point for this whole system. It's kind of like a hierarchy. So centralized exchanges, on-ramps, you need to have some cryptocurrency to kind of engage in Web3 in the first place. And then from that, it goes to wallets. And then from that, it goes to taps. So we'll touch on that as we progress through the interview. But I want to move on to cover, so let's talk about the two research questions for the study. What was the objective for this paper?
I think our general objective was just to kind of get an initial kind of snapshot understanding of like where we're at currently. So knowing that it's still in the very early stages of this kind of technology or space becoming really mainstream. Obviously, it has gained popularity in the last few years for sure, but still isn't something that's just like every day for everyone. So you know, we, and kind of how we would normally approach a lot of our research was kind of like you know, using methods that we can kind of capture sort of a broad understanding of this. So you know, we took an approach of doing an online questionnaire to kind of distribute that more widely to whoever you know, whoever ends up answering it, really, to then just kind of start to get an idea of like what challenges there are, and then you know, the intent for us would be to later kind of do more focused research studies around some of those issues. So if you think about it, you know, distribute one survey, many people can fill it out at one time. If we were to try and interview the same number of people, that's a lot of labor on our part. And while the data that we would collect from the interviews is going to be really good and very detailed, without knowing whether there's something there or not, like kind of doing the survey approach first is kind of a most logical anyway, just to at least get an idea of like, okay, what's the extent of the issue here. The other part of our paper actually was, you know, you mentioned the exchanges, kind of doing an audit of those. So again, it was something that we could kind of easily do while we weren't sure if there was much to actually discover. And so Nash, the lead author of the paper, he did, you know, just auditing those websites. As you said, the importance of the exchanges earlier, you know, we recognized that it is one of those places that anyone that's kind of involved in this sort of domain is going to encounter to some extent. And so, you know, if someone was a screen reader user, can they actually navigate that website?
Mhm.
And if not, well, what's the implications of that? So.
And I think, yeah, I think why we started with the exchanges as well, like you said earlier, that is the kind of natural starting onboarding process for most people in crypto technologies, right? If you go into, you know, trade NFTs or do other kind of BlockFi stuff, you typically enter through an exchange, right? So it made sense to look at the exchanges first and try to understand, well, what is that process like? Even before we dive deeper, right? Like we could have went and done a deep dive on OpenSea, but if you find out that OpenSea is inaccessible because of you can't get access to something off an exchange, then actually that's where you should have focused on your aspects. So it made sense to kind of start at that kind of broader aspect, and then we'll maybe deepen down in the future and look at the other aspects as well.
Mhm, mhm. And we're covering DApp usage in ours as well. So for sure, our studies are very complementary. So I also want to, so you guys touched on it when you mentioned the surveys, and you also mentioned the auditing. I want to touch on the aspects of the study that were qualitative versus quantitative. And you mentioned the reasoning behind your approach. So maybe let's move on to what WCAG findings you had in the audits as well.
Yeah, we took a combination of quantitative and qualitative approaches, and you know, as researchers, that's kind of a decision we're always making when conducting research. So there's, you know, not to say one is better than the other; they both complement each other. So you can answer certain questions with quantitative data that you can't answer with qualitative, and vice versa. And so kind of doing that mixed methods approach is definitely most useful, and kind of getting a much clearer picture of what's going on. So the exchange study that we did, that was kind of more quantitative. That's kind of typical though of like the web content accessibility guideline evaluations. Like you're usually, you know, it's a checklist that you're running through and making an assessment on. And so that part of our study was very much kind of more of a quantitative approach. And then, I mean, what we could do later if we were then wanting to go one step further and understand like why things are happening would be to, interview the people that are making these websites and like why was this the decision that they made to create it in this way versus another way and so on. So there's doing the WCAG audit and that kind of quantitative approach, we can see, okay, there's a problem here, but not necessarily why did that happen. Having said that, there's enough related work out there with web design that we kind of have a good reason we could make a good guess on like what's going on and why that might be the case. Like even though the topic of the website might be new, like it's still a website and web design's been going on for a long time. And so, but then for our questionnaire, we did take a more mixed kind of approach. So we had close-ended and open-ended questions. So we kind of were able to collect both quantitative and qualitative data. Now, I mentioned earlier, like if we did interviews, we would probably get a lot more of a deeper understanding of like some of the experiences that our participants had. So when you try and get them to write in an open text field in a questionnaire, they don't often write as much as if they were, speaking in an interview. And we could then ask follow-up questions or clarifications. There's a lot of benefits to doing the kind of interview side of things. But it kind of comes back down to that, like this was just an initial, like, is there something worth exploring further here? And we found that there is. And so I can't remember though what the completion rate really was, but definitely, I mean, the general kind of thing that you typically find is people are often quick to answer the, close-ended questions, whether that's like check boxes or radio buttons and things. Anything that involves typing the responses is never as thorough. We obviously got enough data to kind of find some interesting insights, but I think certainly our questionnaire probably fell a little bit more on the quantitative side of things with some open-ended questions.
And you mentioned in the paper that the auditor familiarized themselves with the layout of the exchanges. Of course, thinking of like just good UX design in general, people have their own mental models when they come in. So having an understanding of that layout and approaching it in a way that the layout's consistent across these exchanges, but you can tackle like what are the accessibility issues on the layout in general, and then just standardize. From our findings, it's the same story for dApps. A lot of them have like you can categorize them, right? You have NFC Marketplace, you have Dex, you have a portfolio, similar layout, but interestingly, some of the accessibility barriers are of a very diverse nature across even within the same category. So, I believe we mentioned it, but did we touch on the breakdown of the participation in your research from the survey? You had, I believe it was 72 and 23 were crypto adopters.
So we haven't covered that. I don't know if Ben, you want to cover that bit.
Yeah, I mean that pretty much covers it. We kind of asked if in the survey if they'd actually owned or ever utilized crypto technologies, and I think only around, I think, yeah, as you said, 23 participants, or what, 32% of them had actually reported doing so. And I think that kind of goes back to what Gareth was saying before, right? If these websites, which are typically onboarding processes, have accessibility barriers, even in some of the cases we found issues within the sign-up process or just the main landing pages for these websites, then it makes sense that a lot of people might not use them. Now, we're not saying that's the reason people are not using them. There's other reasons for low adoption of crypto adoption, right? But that might be a reason we can't find those participants, right? That's more likely in that case. So yeah, so a big thing of our participants as well, I think 62 participants were screen reader users, so that's about 62 out of the 72. So that's why typically most of our findings are related to screen reader usage issues, because they were screen reader users, right? And that's been kind of a focus of a lot of our work recently, is looking at issues that people have when they use a screen reader. Because that's, if you look at the WCAG setup, a lot of the way that the WCAG was designed, a lot of the access issues are for screen reader users, or keyboard operator users, which are kind of screen reader users too. So it kind of makes sense that a lot of the WCAG violations kind of fall into that camp as well. So I guess across most of the exchanges, the issues were typically perceptibility issues or operability violations, right? So, and again, that makes sense with WCAG because those are the two largest categories of WCAG, right? There's kind of less guidelines for understandability and robustness. So it makes sense that most of the violations are in those top two categories anyway.
And you also in the paper touch on KYC a little bit. I think that's another important point as like regulatory factors come in more and more as time goes on. Just having that KYC be accessible, because like sometimes it's mixed.
And I think what's interesting, and I don't know, I don't think we talked about this in the paper, but KYC should probably be some form of standardization across the industry, or there should be an option to use an accessible version of KYC. There's really no real need for all of these different exchanges and corporations to kind of roll their own KYC process, right? It typically does the same kind of a thing, right? You input a driver license or some other standard form, and there's been good work by other places to make that kind of a process. And I don't mean the actual way that it works in the background, but just the data entry from user perspective, right? So in the UK, the government design agency does a lot of good work on making their design system actually accessible, and they put that design system out for everyone else to use, and you could customize it and style it in different ways. But that process, that putting data into a box, right, process could be fairly standardized and made accessible, and then again that KYC process would be accessible for more users, right? So I think it's definitely something that should be adopted more widely.
For sure. We're discussing WCAG earlier. Can we discover some of the results from that audit, and as well any results from the survey? Do you guys have the data on hand?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Ben was saying, like a lot of the prevalent kind of issues were around perceivable and operable aspects of the web guidelines. So one instance or one example of that, color contrast, there was that was something that every website had an issue with, at least in some area of the web page or other. And it's funny because it's like that's such an easy thing to avoid. Like, there's a lot of criticism around the web guidelines and how usable they are, and how to meet some of them. But the color contrast one is one that specifically just gives you like a threshold to follow. It's like, here's the number to meet. And there's so many different tools out there as well to kind of actually check that and do it. But it always seems to be the one that lots of people never meet. And I think it's kind of comes down to a lot of like current design trends and preferences that people have, and they just design what they want to look nice, or what they think looks nice at least, and it always ends up that there's some issues. So color contrast was a very common issue, and then on the kind of operable side of things, like Ben was saying, people, whether they're screen reader users or they use keyboard commands to kind of navigate, there were issues around that keyboard trap. So you kind of cycle through parts of the page, but then you can't get out of that cycle without using the mouse. So that came up occasionally. Then from the screen reader side of things, so just I guess for the audience, a screen reader is a device, or usually it's a piece of software that runs on most devices now. So your phone has one, your laptop has one. Most operating systems will come with a version of it. So for Mac OS or iOS is VoiceOver. Android is TalkBack, and Windows has Narrator. And then there's like paid versions like Jaws, but effectively the screen reader is kind of reading aloud elements on the screen that the person's navigating to through keyboard commands. So I'll maybe read out the menu on a web page. It might read out the content and so on. So one of the common issues that we found related to kind of screen readers was poor link and button labeling. So usually when you're making a website and you're using HTML to create your like buttons or links, you kind of want that to be done in such a way that a screen reader is going to voice it in such a way that it actually kind of makes sense on what that's going to do. So an example of a poor button label would be like it just says button, or it just says like click here, or something that's not really informative about
the function. Right? That's what's important about, and sorry, jump in there, Gareth. That's something to be important about the way that screen readers work, is that it doesn't just read out what's visually present on the screen, right? It essentially can read out aspects that are being put in there purely for a screen reader user, right? So form labels, for instance. So it doesn't really need to impact on the visual presentation of a website, and that's what Gareth's meaning with regards to buttons, right? So it can read out what's on the button, but it should also have a label that explains what that button does. So if it says submit, it should explain what that submit does, that sort of a thing. So yeah, sorry, I just wanted to jump in and explain that it doesn't just go on the visual view, right?
Yeah. So yeah, when it's kind of reading out these things, you want that kind of descriptiveness to be like if it's the button to log in or something, and like it's a very small change in what has to be read, but it's enough to give context on like what the function of this thing actually is. And so we found examples of that as well. And again, these aren't unusual findings in just the domain of web creation and so on. So like what I was saying, like we could probably use a lot of the prior literature to know why this is happening. Usually there's a lack of education and understanding on accessibility within developers and designers. There's the issues surrounding guidelines, how usable they are, how understandable they are, so on. And then tools is usually the other one as well. So like, do they have the right kind of support through what they're using to kind of guide them in making decisions? And
I think some pages are actually quite complex as well, and I think that actually leads to some of the more prominent errors with some of if you think about a traditional like buying or trading form on a crypto exchange, right? It's got so many different form fields. So in the past, on a very simple website, you might only have a couple of form fields. And I think on a crypto website, because there's such a large variety of ways that you can input and get data, I think that makes it more likely to have kind of input mistakes as well. And again, what Gareth's saying is true, right? That all of these things as well. But I think the complexity of the websites themselves actually might be leading to some of the bigger issues as well.
For sure.
That definitely comes back down onto the developer and designer though. Like that's where they need to either understand how they're supposed to approach those things, or spend more time in kind of doing proper testing, because it's possible to make them accessible. Like we know what needs to be done and how it's done, but people don't often spend the time to actually do it, or they don't fully know how to, whether they've not learned about accessibility during their training or whatever it is. So there's multiple kind of factors in this issue.
For sure. And I think with especially emerging tech and the space in general, it always starts out as a small team, and it's a lot of like bootstrapping, trying to get things working in the first place. So it's like everyone in the space moves fast, right? So everyone's trying to like move really fast to keep up. So they don't stop to consider this aspect. They're just focused on pushing out the specific features. And then so of course we know with accessibility, if you don't do it early, it just the complexity curve of adding it in later, it just keeps getting worse and worse. And then particularly with exchanges, I want to go back to accessibility with regards to exchanges, thinking of like depositing and withdrawing crypto in and out of those exchanges, or like sending to a specific address. There's definitely a lot of complexity and challenges with that, with regards to like hashing of the wallet address itself.
Yeah, and I think that's some of the stuff that we actually had trouble including in the audits, because our auditor didn't have access to funds to go and do actual trades and stuff, right? So he could go through and put information into the box to do a trade, but he couldn't go through and complete a trade, and that sort of thing, right? So some of the websites only allowed you access to those pages after doing KYC. So again, because he couldn't go and make a lot of fake test accounts, essentially, then they didn't get audited in that way either. So there's probably much more issues within those processes that we haven't had a chance to look at yet, and we do have plans to look at them in the future, but that just takes time to get set up. And yeah, we would need some funds to almost do those example trades and move them around, right? So things like testing how to set up like a spot trade or a limit trade, and then acting on that based on notifications and that sort of stuff. I think that would be important to do, but trickier to do at an audit level, because most times when you're doing an accessibility audit, you're just testing the system itself rather than going through and putting data in, right? So you can test that, but it's easier for someone to test that within a company when they can access test accounts and that sort of thing.
For sure.
I want to also say, I think there was a locational limit as well. So Nash and myself, we're based in the US, and I'm sure he had come across some, I think it was with some of the exchanges that we had picked for the study, that there was like a restriction on what he could actually do, in addition to the limits that Ben was saying as well. But there was also, that's something we'd have to consider in the future, studies as well.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think that's the New York State kind of thing, because I guess you guys are in Rochester, right? So I think New York State has different limitations on what you could do on certain crypto websites than other states, for instance. So I think that was one of those things as well.
Yeah, there was definitely something. I can't remember how much detail we went into the paper or if we just kind of had a passing comment about a limit anyway. But there was definitely something that was too much of a headache to try and overcome for the research project, small scale project that we had come up. And so it was like but I think, like you say, those kind of things are complex, and so definitely there's going to be more to uncover there. Probably much the same in terms of like issues for screen readers and so on. I know, like, just banking in general, there's a wealth of data out there, and papers on accessibility issues in banking. So even just kind of traditional sort of banks and their websites and mobile apps, they're not perfect either, and have a lot of the same kind of issues in as well. So.
And yeah, I think one of the things we didn't actually get to dive into as well in the paper that we thought would be interesting is that we only are really talking about access to exchanges within this paper. We're not talking about access to things like cold storage or anything like that, which has just like a much wider, set of usability challenges rather than just accessibility challenges, right? And I think that was what kind of brought us on to doing this paper in the first place, is how accessible, using the different time of the word, that the exchanges are, right? I still remember the kind of first days of doing KYC where you had to like hold up a newspaper with today's date to try and get your account verified on exchanges, right? Where exchanges you can get onboarded probably easier than a bank account now, right? But yeah, I think the other issue with crypto is that if you're actually properly trading and using the systems, is you're transferring crypto between your own wallets on different systems, which you don't typically do a lot in banking, right? It's fairly rare to move money between your own accounts in that way, and usually those processes are kind of almost end to end, right? You send from one location to another and you don't really need to worry about it. Whereas in crypto, yeah, if you get it wrong, then it has bigger implications. So yeah, I think that's kind of interoperability between the exchanges needs to be looked at in more detail. And yeah, it's just something we couldn't do within the remits of this. Again, we're working with a student researcher, so there's limitations around time and resources there as well, where we're doing a bigger project. That's definitely something we would want to look into as well.
For sure, and that's why this research is so valuable. I mean, I think you guys are humble. You call it kind of like tip of the iceberg, but it's imperative because we have to start there. The more surface level there's a barrier, it's still a barrier that prevents everything underneath. So step one, the accessibility of the exchanges. Step two, more of these intense trading schemes, sending, like you said, cryptocurrency between exchanges. I'm thinking from a decentralized aspect, sending it between chains, right? Bridging. Some work has been done with cross-chain interoperability and things like that. So it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, then going into accessibility of decentralized apps, like I said, that whole hierarchy scheme, wallets themselves, and hardware and software, like you said. So I want to end on, so we have discussed conclusions. I want to touch on, I guess, just advice for anyone who's interested in taking on this research, like in teams, projects, whether it's within the bounds of academics or just even if it's like a startup or a company trying to do their own personal research into their own product.
Yeah, so I think Gareth's PhD research and his core research pretty much leads into this. So I'm going to leave Gareth to this question because that's pretty much his wheelhouse, really.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think through this. I guess in terms of like, I think there were two parts to that. So you've kind of got the question of like how to help other researchers or what advice we would give other researchers, and then maybe how to support the people that aren't researchers that are building these systems. So maybe from the researcher perspective, I think knowing that there's not a lot of published work on accessibility of crypto and blockchain, what we ended up doing was kind of looking more broadly, like we mentioned earlier about kind of the research in other kind of financial domains, and even I guess like work in kind of web design and so on. There's a lot out there that gives you good advice in creating accessible systems or conducting research, accessibility research, and what kind of questions that you can kind of ask. So I think it's always good to start with a lot of reading. I know sometimes people don't want to do reading, but I think if you're an academic anyway, then you're fine with that, or should be at least to some extent. So I think any researchers that want to kind of go into this space, I'm also thinking like anyone that's kind of more on the crypto side and not the accessibility side, but wants to do the accessibility stuff, like accessibility as a field is huge. And so you really want to kind of read widely and even kind of collaborate or ensure that you've got certain expertise on your team to kind of make sure you have a good understanding about best practice and so on. So like Ben and I we're not crypto researchers, although I guess you could say we are now, but we've been long time accessibility researchers who happen to both have experience with crypto technology, and kind of we came at it from that angle, because actually interestingly a lot of the work that had been published in this space was kind of just maybe the closest it got to accessibility was usability. And user experience, and like, how can we, improve the user experience of this? That was the closest that any of the crypto research that we came across, beyond all of the very kind of hard mathy type research that exists. That was the closest that it ever got to kind of something towards accessibility.
We found surprising, right? Like, if you think about wider adoption of crypto technologies in general, right? Making them accessible and usable is the way to get this, approach to work. Right? That's and so we were actually quite surprised at how little research had been done within that area. And yeah, even with the usability stuff, we didn't find a lot of people looking at it. It was very sparse stuff. It wasn't like a big look. And if you think about how big that field of crypto technologies is, right? I think Bitcoin's been around for at least a decade now. It's pretty much still as usable or inusable or inaccessible as it was when it first launched, right? So we have the exchanges, but yeah, so it's still not that widely understood in terms of usability.
Yeah, so I think that like there's more crypto researchers out there that I could see might start to look into the accessibility side of things than the accessibility researchers that might get into crypto. And we see that often, that there's a lot of engineers or very technical minded folk that will then try and do an accessibility project. And there's decisions that get made during those projects, or the things that end up getting done, where a lot of the maybe hardcore accessibility researchers might cringe at a little bit. I'll give you an example. You might read a study and it was someone's developing a new technology for blind people. Rather than recruiting blind people, they got sighted people and put a blindfold on them. There's papers out there that do that, and it's usually discouraged from trying to do that. But a lot of people who are making that decision are kind of it's a lack of I guess understanding and knowledge and kind of what harm that comes with that kind of approach. And so that's kind of where, like, any kind of researcher that wants to do this kind of work and that with a real focus on the accessibility side of crypto, make sure that you have the right kind of expertise on your research team, I think. And that's not to say that we know everything. We don't, and we'll probably still make mistakes as well. But definitely, if you're coming from it outside of the accessibility, try and connect with someone that might be able to give you that kind of insights, or at least as a starting point, to kind of ensuring your research is on the right track.
And I think to kind of expand on what Gareth said earlier about reading as well, that even if you can't find research in that particular area, so let's say you can't find a lot of research on the accessibility of crypto technologies, if you kind of read a parallel track to that and read about the accessibility of social media, when there's a wealth of studies on that, you can follow the approaches that those researchers took in doing those studies and then adopt them to something like crypto, right? So it's not just about reading just in the area you're looking at or looking to go into. It's about kind of reading those parallel angles and say, well, it's kind of similar to social media, so could we look at the way that social media is studied in that sort of a thing, and that just allows you to gain access to those kind of other approaches that may be used. And I think, yeah, what Gareth said is to connect with other people and chat to them and even just run ideas past them in terms of study design, which we do anyway with ourselves, but it's better to also do outside of your team to make sure that you just kind of considered all the right angles and that your study design makes sense before you go ahead and put the time into it, and then it comes back and you realize that you just didn't set your thing up, or you didn't recruit the right people, or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. And to end on both your points, it just goes down to involving the right people in the research and just making sure you have people that are actually leveraging these type of technologies or have these accessibility accommodations and considerations in mind. Like not like I think Gareth touched on it as well. Not doing the simulated approach, like that should be thrown out. You have to involve people. Audits are helpful, but there's no replacement for human experience in like these studies, whether it's from a survey-based approach or from a more in-depth, like qualitative interview approach.
Yeah. I just to kind of add to that last point, so kind of I think to the other part of a question you were sort of asking, maybe of like advice to I guess more from the industry side of things. And like definitely there's you know, recruiting people and kind of working with people as the best approach, but that can be challenging and so that's kind of some of the work that I've been doing with like accessible design and like access to resources and how do you actually support you know, digital creators in kind of meeting these recommendations that we often advise, but like if they, you know, depending maybe where they're located or the size of their team, like you mentioned, you know, if you're a startup and you're a small group, like that's a very common thing where you do have limited resources then, and then it's a decision of like where did those resources get applied. And you know, ideally accessibility should always just be something that's like an embedded part of like any project or proposed time frame for a project and all these kind of things, but often it's not the case. But then it's like how we can create whether it's new technology or advice or kind of recommendations, guidelines, whatever, that kind of accounts for that. And I don't have an answer necessarily for it. I mean, this is ongoing research it's a big problem. I think not enough thought has been, or definitely more research needs to kind of be dedicated towards. So I often find in research papers is like, and this is what we recommend, and it's like, okay, but is it practical? Like who benefits from those recommendations and who can't use those recommendations? So that's kind of a big unknown still, or just at least a question to keep in mind when kind of doing work in this space, from either industry or research side of things. And like, you know, everyone kind of has the same end goal of wanting to improve the accessibility, which is great, but we definitely need to kind of at least question whether some of those recommendations work and for who and so on. So yeah, I think that it's an exciting area anyway. There's lots to kind of lots of questions that still need answering, and so I think there's a lot of space. There's always a challenge sometimes where you've got lots of researchers looking at the same problem, and it's like, especially if you're a PhD student, there's the stress of like trying to publish your original results and so on. I think in this kind of area, there's a lot of new territory to explore. So I think, I think in the next few years we might start seeing kind of more research coming out of this topic. And I think the other thing, you've probably come across this. I know Ben and I have chatted about this, but there's a lot of people that kind of are dismissive or against kind of crypto and blockchain. And I'm not necessarily a big advocate for it as such, but recognize that the technology is not going away, and there are certain benefits to the technology. So we really do have to try and do the work to make sure that it's accessible. Like, it's fine if you don't like Bitcoin, but that's just one example of a whole bigger thing that this is trying to go towards. And so I think I think there's maybe some people out there that might eventually come around to like taking it more seriously.
And I think what Gareth's alluding to there is that there's probably researchers out there that could have explored the accessibility of crypto, and they're not exploring it because they don't have the technology, right? Which is probably not a great approach, right? Because if we had people who didn't believe in social media not look at the accessibility of social media early on, then look at where we are with social media now. So I think that's kind of what Gareth's trying to say, right? Is that people, if you're doing it for it, you need to get
expertise and knowledge out there, but not all of it's kind of, and not everyone has to focus on crypto, of course, but and blockchain and all those kind of related technologies, Web3 and everything. But I think that it's definitely, we can't ignore it forever. So
for sure. And I think that's a fantastic point to close on. Here's to hoping that the more individuals and groups take it on outside of ours as well, because it's a positive feedback loop, right? We just feed into each other's papers. And then as well, thank you guys both so much for your time. And we want to also just thank the Ethereum Foundation very quickly for sponsoring this series. So take care.
cool. Thank you
Thank you very much. Bye.